From ABC 7, this is the Maine 2nd Congressional District Forum.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our special coverage of the race for Maine's 2nd Congressional District. No doubt you've seen countless ads from the candidates and various groups campaigning on their behalf, but we wanted you to hear from the candidates themselves at length and uninterrupted. That is why we sat down with both candidates to talk about some of the numerous issues facing our state and our country and where they stand. These are the issues that will shape our future, and it's important to know what path each of them might take. For their interviews, each candidate was given 28 minutes to answer the same slate of questions on a wide range of topics. The interviews will be presented in full and uninterrupted. We begin tonight's program with our conversation with incumbent Representative Jared Golden. Jared, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate your time.
All right, so we have a lot to get to, so let's jump right in. Our first question. Should you be reelected, what would be your first priorities when your new term begins, and why are those your first priorities?
First, a very local issue. Since the last election, we got a freeze on proposed right whale regulations on Maine's lobster fishery. Those were going to be really, really hard for them to comply with. In fact, some people are saying it'd push them right out of business. So we got a 6-year freeze, but we actually started, I say we, the delegation, both senators, Congresswoman Pingree and myself, we wanted 10 years pause on those regs. We ended up with 6, so I'm going to go right back after that extra 4 years because the end of 2028 is going to be here pretty fast, right? So buying a little more time, I think, pretty important. And then I think some of the national, picture is definitely going to be in play early on. So we know that some of the 2017 tax cuts are going to be expiring, and some of those are important. Middle-class tax cuts, I think, need to be extended, and that's definitely going to be like early on in the next Congress, so something I'll be paying attention to. How can we make sure that the middle-class tax cuts continue, but do it in a way that doesn't blow up the deficit even worse than it already is? So trying to be budget neutral with that. We could do things like let the top marginal rate on the income tax for millionaire households, for example, go back to what they were, and then use that revenue to extend the middle-class tax cuts.
Okay. You touched on my next question. As you stated, and as we are aware, lobstermen have dealt with a multi-year battle against these new regulations from NOAA. They are meant to protect right whales, and the lobstermen did have to endure one round of cuts before that pause was put into place with the omnibus bill. As you alluded to, the pause is going to come to an end. So beyond those immediate actions, how do you work with NOAA on a new set of regulations that will protect right whales, but also protect the lobster industry? How do you work with them?
I think that, first of all, I'm not sure that I would say that I think the regulations are justified. And, it's a conversation about trade-offs. I don't want to belittle the importance of the right whale species, but the, economic hit on coastal communities and here in Maine, and in particular for those fishing families, would just be so great that I'm really not willing to see them put out of work. So that's just a position that I hold, and so I think we're going to continue to make the case that these regulations aren't going to work and come at too great a cost to fishermen.
Okay.
I think well, go ahead.
I was going to say, along those same lines, how do you prevent further cuts and enable more research on the presence of right whales in the Gulf of Maine?
Well, one thing I definitely advocate for is more input from the fishing community itself. There's this kind of attitude sometimes that the people who are doing the work in an industry can't be trusted to be a part of the conversation about regulation. I hear people say, well, they have a financial interest. And that's just not the way that I have seen the fishing community operate. They're very collaborative. They know what's going on in the water. They have a lot of wisdom. And I think just getting more feedback from them and making sure they have a seat at the table is one way to actually help NOAA do a better job.
Okay. Also, along those same lines, ship strikes are known to be a lethal threat to right whales as well. How do you work with the powerful shipping industry to address those ship strikes and create concrete changes, not suggestions, but concrete changes that will also protect right whales?
Yeah, I've actually been writing letters to NOAA and multiple different decision makers in federal government to say, let's not forget about the ship strikes. We understand that they're maybe more hesitant to go after freight because of the economic hit, which is very big and broad. If you think about our economy and how important that is. So I think there's a reluctance to go after them. But at the end of the day, there's way more proven deaths of right whales and other whales from ship strikes than there is anything having to do with fishing gear entanglements.
Okay, I want to pivot to the subject of nursing homes in the state of Maine. Nursing homes are closing down in our state, and when that happens, that puts in peril Mainers' ability to age in a safe and welcoming environment other than their home when that's not possible. What is your plan to keep nursing homes in Maine open and enable the creation of more affordable housing for older Mainers working from the federal level?
I've worked with the delegation and through the budget process to get earmarks for some of our nursing homes right here in Maine that were about to close down and needed help, specifically Maine Veterans Homes and their locations in Caribou and Machias were going to be closed. I was able to get $3 million towards helping them offset their losses and get a commitment from their board to keep those facilities open. I think it would have been really awful had they closed. So that's one piece. Staffing issues. I think putting money into training programs. We need more nurses in the state. It's something I've done. I actually got an earmark for Husson University for their nursing program, like a new kind of more high-tech, modern lab. Really important. And I've worked closely with people in the industry on trying to find the right balance of safe staffing, but also recognizing that if we overregulate in that regard with such a small workforce and the problems trying to fill positions, that it could lead to closures of homes for lack of good workers. So I've tried to push to say, let's make sure that we're not forcing closures, even if we don't have all of the workers that we might need. We got to think about the people who would have nowhere to go if those nursing homes closed.
And of course, affordable housing is a crisis not just in Maine, but across the country, and it's not just applicable to seniors. So how do you work, again, from the federal level to create more affordable housing for all Mainers who need it, whether that be homes to buy or apartments to rent?
I think deregulation is the name of the game on construction and trying to get more supply of homes here in this country. And a lot of that does have to do with like municipal and state regulations. But as I've talked to a lot of people that work in the construction industry, they've pointed at that as their kind of top priority for trying to make it easier to build affordable homes. Okay. I do think it's good that the Fed, seeing that inflation is starting to smooth, not that it's back to where it was before, but things are getting better, and so they've decided to start cutting interest rates, and that's certainly going to help on the demand side of making it more affordable for people to get that home loan.
Okay. I want to pivot to a hot button issue at the national level. Do you support any kind of federal abortion ban with or without exceptions?
I'm not in favor of any kind of ban. I'm pro-choice, very strongly support women's reproductive freedom and their right to choose an abortion, and I've supported legislation that would codify the protections that were afforded by Roe v. Wade, which has, of course, been repealed. And my voting record reflects my position here, so I think,
okay. And a follow-up to that.
Maybe like a floor of federal protection, the opposite of a ban, right?
The opposite.
We do see some states that have done what I refer to as de facto bans, 6-week abortion bans, where many women don't even know that they're pregnant at that point. So I think some kind of federal protection that set a baseline of access would be something that I would support.
Okay, and so a follow-up to that, even though you've alluded to it, do you also support and would you eradicate the prosecution of clinicians who perform abortions and procedures resulting from a previous abortion, the denial of which has caused preventable deaths among women? So yeah, where do you come down on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's just wrong. We can't be going after doctors and healthcare professionals.
Okay, and will you vote for or against legislation that protects IVF?
I would be in favor of protecting IVF.
Okay. Another important topic, protecting Social Security and Medicare. Do you support any manner of cuts to Social Security or Medicare? And if you do not, do you pledge today to vote against any measure that includes such cuts?
What I think we should do with Social Security to try and address the budget shortfall that is around the corner, which would trigger benefit cuts of about 20%. I've heard someone say 18, but it's ballpark. That'd be a pretty big cut for seniors who count on Social Security. So my plan is right now on the payroll contributions, people stop at $168,000. So they pay on all of their income below that level, but if they make more, then they don't pay anything. So you could take someone that's making $300,000, they pay on that first 168, they don't pay 168 to 300. It's kind of a donut hole type, gap. And if we would just lift that restriction so that they paid in on every dollar that they earn, then we could eliminate like 75% of the shortfall for Social Security and make sure that it's there for our middle class seniors who really need it. In the Medicare space, I like the work that we've done recently, like in the Inflation Reduction Act. By allowing the government to actually negotiate better terms from pharmaceutical companies, have been able to lower the cost of providing prescription medications to seniors. That's going to save the Medicare Trust Fund several $100 billion over 10 years. So we're pushing down the cost of that important healthcare benefit, and also passing off some of those savings to seniors in the form of $35 insulin now for those that have diabetes. Beginning on January 1 of next year, we'll be capping out-of-pocket costs for prescription medications annually at $2,000. So if someone has high-cost medication needs, they're going to get some good protection there. And the analysis suggests that that's going to save Maine seniors in the district is over $100,000, somewhere between $100 and $500 per year, depending on their personal circumstances.
Okay. We certainly talk a lot about interest rates, and we've, as you alluded to, we've seen good news from the Fed recently about significant cuts to those interest rates, but nevertheless, everyday necessities like groceries and gas remain expensive. What do you feel are the specific solutions needed to bring down the cost of living for Maine people?
Well, I was just talking about healthcare savings, and that's one thing that you can do. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we also brought down the cost of healthcare premiums for about 30,000 families here in Maine 2nd District. That's through subsidies that lower their premiums, average saving up about $500. So, addressing high costs of healthcare is one thing that we can do. We also, I think, have successfully increased oil and gas production through new leases for production, drilling, extraction on federal lands, so that's helping to bring down the cost of gas anyway. And then I think that you just have to pay attention to federal spending and do what you can to tamp that down, which puts downward pressure on spending, from the government, and that can help address inflation. We've already seen that working a little bit. This last Congress has focused on reducing the size of our federal deficit to try and bring it in the right direction, and I think it's starting to pay off.
Okay. You've touched on this already, but just in the interest of keeping consistent and asking the questions, specifically with regard to the cost of health care, as you've already talked about, are there steps that should be taken that you haven't already mentioned that would ensure that Mainers always have access and can afford the health care they need?
Well, those savings in healthcare for those 30,000 families I was just referring to actually expire at the end of 2025. So I think we got to look at trying to extend those and keep them in place. And I think that'll be part of the discussion with the what we referred to earlier in regards to the expiration of middle-class tax cuts, which also should be extended.
Okay. Maine is also facing a major physician shortage in the coming year. We don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough doctors, and that's by the tens of thousands. The Association of the American Medical Colleges says the U.S. will need to hire more than 100,000 doctors over the next 12 years. How do you recruit more physicians to the state of Maine so that folks can receive the health care they need without waiting, weeks or even months for appointments, as tends to happen right now?
Yeah, I think you got to ask the professionals about that one.
Yeah.
The people who work at our school system here for training doctors. I do support some action in the federal budget that helps pay for like programs for doctors to do like their kind of like their internships, here in Maine. And of course, I'll do anything I can to keep our hospital systems financially healthy and make sure that they're getting whatever support we can offer so that they're in a good position to hopefully attract those doctors.
Okay. I want to pivot to an important subject. In the wake of the final report on the Lewiston mass shooting, Senator Susan Collins drafted legislation that involves holding military leaders more accountable for when service members appear to be a potential threat to themselves or others. Would you support such legislation were it to come to a vote?
I'd want to see the details of it, but I think that military leaders are always looking to hold themselves to a high standard and are for accountability. So my guess is that they'll want to be supportive of that, and it's likely something that I'd be willing to support, but obviously I'd want to wait and see what's actually in it.
Okay. What other potential gun control measures, if any, do you support? For instance, and we can kind of tick down this list. For instance, do you support universal background checks?
No.
Okay. Do you support yellow or red flag laws?
I have voted against red flag laws. Of course, the yellow flag law in Maine was put into place after I had left the legislature, and I understand that people want to see it work more smoothly, and they've taken some of the lessons learned since it's been in law, and they're trying to improve upon it, but that's a state level issue.
Okay. And do you support bans on assault-style weapons?
As you know, after the Lewiston shooting, I've said we got to have a serious conversation about what to do about this. I don't think you can legislate an end to gun violence when it comes, or to mass shootings, unfortunately, more of a societal problem. But I do think we could do things that could help save lives. The high levels of fatality when assault rifles are in the picture for these types of shootings speak for themselves about the deadliness of these firearms. So I think more people would go home alive if we were able to reduce the number of dangerous individuals that have these types of firearms.
And what do you feel then is the solution, or are the solutions to the epidemic of gun violence in our country?
Again, I don't know that there's a legislative fix there, but I've said, used to have a requirement to get a permit to carry concealed here in this state. I said for those that people like myself who want to have a rifle like an AR-15, maybe we should have some kind of permitting system that has a higher threshold for those who can be trusted to own it responsibly and for the right reasons. Try and make sure that people are getting screened out who are going through a mental health crisis, as we saw with the Lewiston shooter. People who might have other, officials might have a reason to believe maybe they're not someone who should be owning such a deadly firearm.
Okay. Pivoting again, Maine was one of the hardest hit states by the opioid epidemic. Countless families have suffered as a result of addiction. More recovery facilities and beds are sorely needed in the state of Maine, as well as programs to help support recovering addicts as they try to move forward. What is your plan to help bring more of these needed services to the state of Maine?
I think you just support the HHS budget, which will give funding to states to make their own kind of pathways on how to address this issue. So a lot of federal money then flows into the state budget, and they figure out how to put resources towards addiction recovery programs, et cetera. I think on the supply side, you got to go after the source of some of these drugs coming into the country. So fentanyl obviously is a key focus. I've been a part of a task force, the cartel task force. It's a bipartisan group of members of the House of Representatives. It's led by Dan Crenshaw. He's a Republican from Texas. And we've been trying to talk about policies that would crack down on the cartels and try and get them to back off on what they're doing. So we've even discussed potential authority for military strikes against their leadership network, ways that we could make it harder for them to move money around. You know, obviously they're engaged in money laundering type activities. And then there's even you know, legal loopholes that are dangerous that are allowing fentanyl into the country that has nothing to do with the border. So there's a little known kind of trade policy called de minimis, where it used to be set pretty small. It was kind of put into place so Americans abroad could send goods home if it was under a certain threshold without having to go through customs. It's been arbitrarily raised in the last couple, years to like $800. And what we're finding in this day and age, where people buy a lot of things online, is that's a giant loophole. And a lot of the precursors that get used to make fentanyl here in the United States are coming in that way. We know it is, but the law enforcement can't do anything because of that law. So I think a number of us from that task force have been pushing for a change, and the Biden administration is actually going to lower that threshold and try and crack down on that.
Okay. A couple quick follow-ups. Do you support decriminalization of illicit drugs or safe injection sites being implemented?
You know, I opposed that when I was in the Maine legislature, and I don't think that's something that I would support at this time. You know, I think I just don't think that's the right route.
Okay. You mentioned border security and immigration, of course, top of mind. What are the specific elements of a border security bill that you would support?
Well, I've supported a lot of border security funding through the years, about $80 billion for CBP, for our Border Patrol, for ICE, about $7 billion for border fencing, border wall specifically. We have put in place a 22,000 Border Patrol agency force, very focused on the southern border. So I've already been willing to put the resources there. The people often talk about comprehensive immigration reform. The Senate tried to do something that was bipartisan in this Congress, as you know. It was heavy on border security, with a little bit of immigration reform, particularly in the asylum, claiming process. And I would have supported that if it had made it out of the Senate and come down to the House. Unfortunately, Republican leadership openly said, we don't want to do this. We want to, keep this issue alive for the election. They think it's a good tool to use against Democrats, and that comes at a high cost for the American people, unfortunately. But that's something that I would likely support.
Okay. And a follow-up in terms of border security and immigration, in your view, what role should the state of Maine play in the landscape of immigration in the U.S.?
I mean, Maine has to obviously look out for our own northern border and enforce the border laws, both for people coming and going, but also economic issues. We have sometimes cabotage issues, meant to protect American jobs being abused, or businesses finding loopholes to work around that. There's been some talk. Senator Collins and King, I think, have a bill, and Congresswoman Pingree and I would support, because we do see asylum seekers here in Maine, and often they're unable to work for such long periods of time, which is really unfair to them and unfair to the communities who could benefit from having them in the workforce, and often have to give assistance because they're not eligible for federal benefits, even though they're here under a legal status until their claim for asylum is processed. So we've proposed giving them work permits while they wait for that process to work through the system.
Okay. And the final question, when people think of you as a candidate and when they are at the polls, what is the one thing that you want people to remember most about you as they consider which box to check?
I want them to consider the record that I've had for 6 years and remember who I am. I feel like through 3 elections and 6 years and all my work in the Congress and travel around the district that people have had a chance to really get to know me. And of course there's a whole campaign out there trying to convince folks that I've changed or I'm a different guy. I'm the same guy that they voted for in 2018, 2020, 2022, and I'm going to keep doing the job the way that I've done it, which has been thoughtful, nuanced, trying to be pragmatic. I have a very bipartisan voting record that I'm proud of, and I hope that people appreciate it. And it's in their hands now, so I appreciate them, and it's been a huge honor doing this now for 6 years.
Okay. I think we do have a couple minutes left technically in your time period, so if there's anything I haven't touched on or any responses you would like to add to, you have a couple minutes left if there's anything else you'd like to say.
I'm all set.
You're all set. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Appreciate you.
All right.
From ABC 7, this is the Maine 2nd Congressional District Forum.
Welcome back in, everyone. Here now is our conversation with State Representative Austin Theriault. Mr. Theriault, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's just get right to it. What will be your first priorities if you are elected and your new term begins? When you first get into office, what do you hit the ground running to do?
Well, I actually think there's 2 things. I think we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. The number one issue that voters talk about when I knock on their door or go to an event is the cost of living. Whether it's groceries, heating oil, we're coming up on the winter time and people are going to be having to fill up their oil tanks. It's going to be a tough winter for people because they're seeing 30, 40, 50% increases just compared to a couple of years ago. And then, the second thing, and it's personal to me because I have people in my family that deal with substance abuse, is really tackling the open border. And I know this shouldn't be a political thing. This shouldn't be a Republican versus Democrat issue. We do know that we have, over 10 million people that have come across illegally. They're not using the system as it legally stands right now. Unfortunately, there are tons and tons of fentanyl that are coming across the border into our towns. Whether it's Fort Kent, whether it's Freiburg, or right here in Bangor. We've got to do something about that. We have to secure our border, and that's a day one issue. I believe the next Congress on day one is going to have to meet and propose legislation that is very, very tough on the border situation, and we've got to look at reducing wasteful spending, because what we've seen with wasteful spending is it tends to drive inflation. We've seen our budget deficit skyrocket, and this is not necessarily just blamed on the Democrats. This has been going on for many years, but it's increased over the past 4 years to a point where families can't even make ends meet.
That's certainly something that we as journalists hear about all the time too, is how people are struggling. A follow-up to your comment about the border, I think so many people tend to focus on the southern border, and certainly there are issues there that have been topics of conversation for quite a while. But in your view, and because of where we are in this country, should there be also equal focus on the northern border as well?
Absolutely. We should focus on the northern border and the southern border. And my frustration sometimes at a national level when we're talking policy is everybody says we have a crisis on the southern border, but we forget how much land we share with the Canadians on the northern border. I come from Fort Kent, right there. I literally grew up and you could see the border. And we actually had friends across on the other side. They're dealing with challenges too. We have people that are coming to Canada and then going across the border into the United States. Knowing that we have a lot of forest land, we have a lot of unpatrolled border up there, we need to increase the technology. We need to make sure that the Border Patrol has enough agents on the northern border. And frankly, I believed that constituents in the 2nd District have been failed by our current leadership. We've seen one of the toughest Border Patrol measures to make it to the floor of the House, H.R. 2. Jared Golden voted against. So you can't say you're for border security and then before the crisis really exploded, before we had the 10 million plus illegals coming to our country, you had an opportunity to vote yes on one of the toughest border security measures ever to make it to the House floor. You can't do both at the same time. I would have voted for that measure, and I believe that measure would have been responsible for putting a stop to the crisis, and we wouldn't be in this mess right now.
Okay. We will get back to the border later in our conversation, but for now, Maine lobstermen have dealt with a multi-year battle against new regulations from NOAA meant to protect right whales, and while they did have to accommodate one round of cuts to the number of end lines in the water, further cuts were stopped thanks to last year's omnibus bill, but that pause isn't going to last forever. It's going to end in a few years. How will you work with NOAA on a new set of regulations, a new biological opinion that will both protect right whales and the lobster industry? We all know how important the lobster industry is to the state of Maine on multiple levels. So how will you work with NOAA on that new plan? And then how do you prevent further cuts and enable additional research as far as the presence of right whales in the Gulf of Maine?
Yeah, this is a complex question, but it's an important question. So the reason I can talk very comfortably about this issue is because I come from a natural resource family. We made a living in the woods. We made a living on the farm. And very similar to what's going on the coast, we have a natural resource industry that's literally fighting for its survival. Whether it's NOAA, whether it's the ropeless traps, and the windmills that are being proposed, they're getting taken on from multiple angles. Golden voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the reasons that we have offshore wind being developed in the Gulf of Maine. He says he's not supportive of wind, but yet his actions in voting for the billions of dollars in spending has got us to the situation now where companies, including the federal government, are now actively looking at where they're going to be placing these wind turbines. The lobster industry is completely against that. I'm completely against that, and I'm going to fight on day one to make sure the next administration puts a stop to these leases going on in the Gulf of Maine. As it relates to NOAA, NOAA, once again, is one of the agencies that's driving these regulations and driving the lobster industry out of business. In the Inflation Reduction Act, there was increased funding for NOAA. And once again, NOAA's been a failure when it comes to listening not only to the research. If you ask the lobstermen and women on the boats, they're saying that some of the research that is used to restrict their fishing is research that's bad. It's not actually asking the fishermen, hey, where do you fish? Like, where are the lobster? Let's get a count of where the lobsters are in that location. They're doing it somewhere, in some cases, in different locations using different technologies. And so I think it's a reality versus concept. And the reality is I'm going to take the sides of the lobstermen, and unfortunately the bureaucrats in D.C. always take the side of theory, and there's a huge disconnect at the coast right now, unfortunately, for the future of the industry. One of the long-term fishermen told me, he said, I'm telling my kids to go and do something different and not take over our family business. How sad is that for an industry that's been here for that long, to where we have the next generation being told there's no future in it. So I'm going to be a fighter for this industry.
We also know, speaking of the data and the research that's been done, ship strikes are a lethal threat to right whales. We hear that over and over again. A ship has hit a mother whale, a ship has hit a calf whale. Even if it survives, it could be mortally injured. And so how do you work with the powerful shipping industry to address ship strikes, boat speeds, protected berthing grounds, and create concrete changes to eradicate that threat to right whales?
So we obviously want to protect the natural, the wildlife in our state and in the oceans, but I think we can do both at the same time. I don't think you have to put an industry at risk. If we just talked about the lobster industry, we don't have to put an industry at risk. There are technologies out there that we can implement to make sure that boats are not hitting the whales. I will say though, just as a note, I've done some research on this, and I have people on my team that are very much educated on this issue. There's much more of a threat by the windmills and the way that they do research on the windmills to the right whales than there ever has been when it comes to ship strikes. And that has to be noted because there's a whole push to put offshore wind on the coast of Maine, which is going to decimate the lobster in the fisheries. And people from both sides of the aisle are opposed to this. We have to look at that as a threat to our natural wildlife and to our industries. And that's proving to be more of a threat than the ships hitting them. Okay.
Data certainly suggests that ship strikes are at least equal with entanglements as far as threats and data points as far as whale mortalities. So the ship strikes are a problem. And so, do you have any specificity as far as how you avert shift strikes?
Well, we need to work with the partners in the industry. I don't think that they want to be, striking whales. So this is going to be both a governmental solution as well as working within the industry to make sure that they have the technology and the resources available to know where the movements of the whales are, so we can be one step ahead.
Okay. I want to pivot now to nursing homes and affordable housing. So nursing homes certainly closing down in the state of Maine is a problem we hear about, and that puts in peril older Mainers' ability to age in at least a safe and welcoming environment if, when they can't age in their own homes. So what is your plan to keep nursing homes in Maine open and then enable the creation of more affordable housing for older Mainers and doing that work from the federal level?
We need long-term funding when it comes to our nursing homes. I don't know if you saw or probably reported on in the budget that passed at the state level, once again kicking the can down the road and not looking at how can we actually fund these nursing homes sustainably over the long run, because some of them are shutting down. And if you're somebody who's paid into the system, you have family here, what we've seen up in the county with nursing homes closing, and this is going on, it's not just in Aroostook County, it's other areas. The state does have the money right now to double down their investments to make sure that they have long-term funding. So this is going to be something I'm going to look at when I'm in DC, but obviously continue to encourage the state to make sure that these homes are funded. When it comes to affordable housing, it's once again a complicated issue. We have inflation that's driven up the cost of building supplies, of labor. Permitting is always an issue. I always talk to builders that say it's a nightmare to get a project permitted. And if we really want to be serious about this, we've got to look at each one and figure out how can we get more access to affordable housing. Workforce housing has come up a lot. I talk to employers, whether it's mills or whether it's hospitals or even school systems that are having to transport their workers 20, 30, 40, 50 miles. That's the only access they have. If they love their job and they want to stay there, they have to travel an hour or more a day. And you shouldn't have to do that in Maine.
Right. You touched on affordable housing, a crisis really nationwide. So how specifically, again, working from the federal level, do you create more affordable housing for all Mainers who need it, whether that's homes to buy or even just creating more apartments, affordable apartments to rent?
So, the state tried looking at this a couple years ago with easing and sort of taking away some of the challenges when it comes to, localities putting restrictions on where they can build housing. That's moving forward. I know that there's still a lot of conversations about that. This is definitely more of a state-by-state issue. Right now, I know that there are smart people looking into it. But my thing is, less restrictions are going to allow more houses to be built. And until we can get the cost of housing down for developers, if I want to build an apartment complex, you know how complicated it is to go through the system, to go through Maine Housing, to go through and get permits, to get the money to build housing. That's why we have these big companies and corporations coming in and taking over, in a lot of cases, these local communities and the housing that's there. We need to make sure from a ground-up approach that the regular small guy or lady that wants to invest in their community can build a 5-unit apartment complex or a 10-unit apartment complex. It's not necessarily 100 or 200 units that we need now that would help, but it's rural areas that are being left behind. There's money that's out there, but these rural areas being left behind in the fight for funds.
Okay. I want to shift now to a topic that has been a hot button issue for a very, very long time, and certainly of late, and that is reproductive health care. Do you support on any level, just in theory, do you support any kind of federal restriction on abortion or federal ban on abortion, either with or without exceptions?
I don't support a federal ban on abortion. What we've seen, and this has been a highly contentious issue, unfortunately, we've seen politicians and political parties use this as a way to divide us. I certainly think that there's a lot of things that we can agree on when it comes to making sure women have access to health care. That's important to them. I come from the St. John Valley up in Aroostook County, have a great relationship with my mom. My grandparents just lost my grandmother last week, and she was very important to me. She paved a path for us. She was a fighter. She had quite a few kids. She worked hard. She worked she worked out in the private sector. She didn't just stay at home, especially even later on in life. So that's the sort of people that I talk to when it comes to these complicated issues. But it's very disappointing that it always turns into right versus left issue when it really should be an American issue.
So when you say, you said you don't support any a federal abortion ban. Do you support or not support the prosecution of clinicians who perform abortions or procedures resulting from a previous abortion? You know, the denial of those procedures has reportedly caused preventable death among women. So what is your stance on disciplining or penalizing clinicians who perform those services?
Yeah, I don't think that's right. We're seeing that is potentially come out in the news over the past couple weeks. It's an unfortunate situation. I don't think that would happen here in Maine. I know different states have different laws, and the reason that I believe that this is more of a states' rights issue is because of what happened with the Supreme Court just a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And in terms of IVF, in terms of, you know, there's been a lot of conversations about looking at protecting access to IVF. That would be something I would look at. To make sure that you know, families have, especially if they want to have kids. We live in a society now where people are having less and less kids, and this IVF may be a way for people who wouldn't have otherwise had kids to be able to want to raise a family.
All right, so you support protecting IVF then, because that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Okay. Shifting topics now, we hear a lot about protecting Social Security and Medicare. Do you support any cuts, theoretical or, you know, proposed to Social Security or Medicare? And if you don't, do you pledge today to vote against measures that would include such cuts?
Yeah, I've talked about not making cuts to Medicare and Social Security, and despite that, we're being attacked on that issue. I don't know how much more clear I can be. I talk about my grandfather, my grandparents who have relied on Social Security and Medicare. This is a lifeline for a lot of seniors. And I hate to see that it's being used as a political weapon in an election year. The reality is there's a lot of waste in government unrelated to this. You know, we're giving housing to illegals. You know, we're wasting money on things like that. And for even in my party, if it were to come to the floor, I would vote against any cuts to Medicare and Social Security. And I've said I'm going to buck my party. I don't care if it's a Republican proposal or a Democratic proposal. If it takes money out of seniors' pockets right now when they're having trouble affording groceries and heating oil, it's something I'm going to vote no on. I'm not afraid to be a leader on this issue. There's a lot of other ways we can look at making cuts, but certainly not on the backs of hardworking seniors.
Okay. We certainly have had some good news from the Fed about a significant cut to interest rates. They're predicting additional cuts through the remainder of the year as well. But everyday necessities like groceries and gas, as we've discussed, remain expensive. What do you feel are the specific solutions needed to bring down the cost of living for Maine people?
You know, energy is a huge driver of inflation. I look at the articles that come out, it's almost on a weekly basis right now of businesses closing, small businesses closing, or at least looking at downsizing. There was a Milo chip plant. I don't know if you heard about that recently, the chip plant in Milo. They said they're going to consider closing down because of the expense of energy on their bottom line. And so the reality is we see all of the Green New Deal spending that's gone on, which my opponent Jared Golden's voted for in the Inflation Reduction Act. Windmills, solar panels. I'm all for a clean environment, but if it's going to increase the cost of energy for our people living on a fixed income, for our seniors, and for our small businesses who can't even survive right now, then we've got to look at different means of energy. We've got to look at lowering the cost of energy. Energy has to do with keeping food at the grocery store. Grocery store has to pass that cost on to the consumer. Energy has to do with transportation. Think about the trucks that travel up and down the highway. I come from Aroostook County, and right now the potatoes are coming out of the ground, and they're going to have to be stored for a period of time until they can be sold to the market. The energy cost that it takes to store those potatoes, that's passed on to the consumers. So I want to look at an all-the-above energy approach, but focusing not only on the cleanliness of the source of energy, but the cost. If it's not a good deal for taxpayers, then it shouldn't be something that we spend billions of dollars on subsidies on. There was a subsidy that came out from the Inflation Reduction Act that Golden voted for, and you know who made out on that was a solar panel company, and we have that going on. Meanwhile, people are struggling to make ends meet. That's just a total misuse of taxpayer dollars.
With specific regard to the cost of health care, that's something else we hear a lot about. What steps should be taken to ensure that all Mainers have access to the health care that they need?
Well, I was just, it's funny you mentioned that. I was just on the phone with one of my local hospitals who over the past 5 years, four years in particular, has lost literally millions of dollars. Hospitals are closing down in the state. If we don't get serious about trying to find a way to make sure they have access to long-term funding, we're going to be in deep trouble, especially in rural areas. One of the things they're looking at doing right now is becoming a critical access hospital. A lot of hospitals are thinking of transitioning from, you know, what you'd consider as a traditional hospital pay for service into more of a what's the cost of the services they provide, because the cost in Fort Kent may be different than the cost for a hospital in Bangor, because they have, you know, access to people. There's some different costs there in those metrics. So we're going to have to look at probably revamping some of those federal programs to make sure that, you know, the 21st century is different than it was 50 years ago. Rural Maine, unfortunately, I think is getting left behind in some of these discussions. I'm going to be a voice for rural Maine because I was born there, I was raised there, it's very concerning that we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about nursing homes, we're talking about all these important things. Meanwhile, we're paying for people that are coming across the border, free housing, free health care, you know, welfare benefits, and these people are being left behind.
Okay. Maine is also facing a major physician shortage in the coming years. That's a national problem as well. The Association of American Medical Colleges says the U.S. is going to need to hire about 100,000 more doctors over the next 12 years. So how do you work from the federal level to make it easier or to recruit physicians to the state of Maine so that Mainers can receive needed health care in a timely fashion, as opposed to waiting weeks or months for an appointment, which is the case now quite frequently?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it piggybacks along what we just talked about before. So there are professionals from other countries that want to come to the United States to practice medicine, but they're getting caught up in the immigration process. It's being delayed. In this particular case, where we're trying to get a doctor from Canada, we're trying to get his medical license here in the United States. This has been backlogged for months. There's no need of that. There are patients that are trying to get scheduled with this new doctor, and they can't get scheduled because the state's dragging on it, and the feds are dragging on it. So we need some sort of expedited process to get professionals who are trained, who are trusted in their field of practice into the United States. And that's what I'm going to do when I'm in D.C.
Okay. In the wake of the final report on the Lewiston mass shooting, Senator Susan Collins is drafting legislation, or has drafted legislation, that involves holding military leaders more accountable, and the military more accountable for when service members appear to be a potential threat to themselves or others. Would you support such legislation were it to come to a vote?
I'd certainly take a look at it. I haven't dove into the exact language. I need to see the language before committing to vote for one way or the other. But what you said, it just highlights the fact that a lot of people have gotten this wrong. Unfortunately, got it wrong right from the beginning. Golden came out in a press conference and made this about guns and made this about the Second Amendment. Unfortunately, what we're seeing from the report, I read through the interim report and then the final report, is that this was a failure of the laws that were already on the books. This gentleman there was a lot of warning signs with him. His family was calling out for help, and there are institutions that dropped the ball. So I'm for looking at streamlining the process of reporting, making sure if somebody is dangerous and they've either committed crimes or going to commit crimes, that the resources are there to apprehend them and take their weapons away. The state of Maine already has a law right now that could have been implemented in this case. It was the yellow flag law. There was a bipartisan law that came through. The governor signed just a couple years ago, and in this case, Mr. Card could have been apprehended under that law. There's no need for an expanded attack on the Second Amendment, and that's the difference between Golden and I, which is why Sportsman Alliance of Maine, Gun Owners of Maine gave me an A on sportsman issues in the Second Amendment, and they gave him an F because they feel, and a lot of voters feel, like he flip-flopped on this issue.
All right, there's a couple other talking points surrounding gun control, things that have come up before that I just want to get kind of a yes or no brief response to. Universal background checks, are you a yes or a no on universal background checks?
I'm not. I believe that the issue here is mental health.
Okay. Yellow or red flag laws, you mentioned, the laws that are already on the books here in the state of Maine. Do you support such laws as those?
I support the current law as it stands in the books. I don't support efforts for red flags because I believe that unfairly goes after law-abiding Mainers.
Okay. And then bans on assault-style weapons, is that something you'd support or not support in any case?
That's one of the differences between Golden and I, is Golden flip-flopped. He went from defending the Second Amendment and now is in favor of banning perhaps one of the most widely used weapon and widely owned weapons in the state of Maine. I believe this is a mental health issue.
Okay.
We need to look at the failures in that system and encourage advancements, more access, more resources so that people can get the help they need.
Okay. We have about 4 minutes left, but I did my final question as far as gun control is anything else from as far as you're concerned about talking about what is the solution to the epidemic of gun violence in this country?
It's a complex issue. I have people in my family that are on the front lines of community mental health. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I promise you I'm not, because I've looked into this. When we pulled investments from institutions here, particularly in the state of Maine, where people could go to get access to help for extended periods of time, everybody said it was going to be made up for by access to community mental health. And if you talk to people who are working in community mental health, they feel like there was a lack of seriousness, a lack of investment, and we're seeing the result of that over a period of years and decades. This is not an issue that's going to be turned around in one day or 1 month, but we need to seriously look at reforming this to make sure that the funds are available. When people are calling out for help, why are they waiting in emergency rooms for weeks? Why are kids in particular not getting access to help when they need it? So turning this into a political issue about guns does frustrate me, because I think we can also defend the Second Amendment and look at reducing violence and crime and isolation and loneliness and this epidemic of depression, in some cases people feeling left behind in our communities. We can do both at the same time.
Okay, I want to move on to the next topic. Maine is was one of the hardest hit states, continues to be one of the hardest hit states by the opioid epidemic, particularly fentanyl. Most currently, countless families suffer as a result of opioid addiction, drug addiction. More recovery facilities and beds are sorely needed, as well as programs to support recovering addicts who are now trying to move forward in their lives. What is your plan to help bring more of these much needed services to the state of Maine? And we do have a 2-minute warning, but I wanted to give you that question.
Well, we need a more holistic approach to mental health and substance abuse. Traditionally, it's been, if folks have mental health issues, they'll get care. They have substance abuse issues, they get care. And there's not always the level of communication that's necessary, because these are complex cases and what they call dual diagnosis, and people that are struggling with both. They're co-occurring disorders. We need to encourage clinicians and people, certainly, even in the public, to raise awareness for the fact that people can be struggling with both at the same time. I'm committed to raising awareness to that, to having those tough conversations. As I mentioned, I have personal stories of people in my family that struggle from some of this stuff. And it can be difficult to have, but making sure that they have access to people who care, who love them, is extremely critical, especially right now in a culture that sometimes feels like people feel like they get left behind.
Okay.
And that's a sad thing.
All right, I want to ask the final question. When people think of you as a candidate and when they go to the polls, what is the one thing you would want people to remember about you most? What do you want people to take with them when they go to fill out their ballot?
Well, I want to make sure that people understand that this is an election where I believe folks are going to be looking beyond political party. I've made this campaign about people over politics. I'm somebody that believes that we need less extremism, more balance in Washington. Washington is certainly broken. If you ask the average voter, they'll just say they feel like Washington's left them behind. Coming from a rural part of the state in Fort Kent, I understand that the average Mainer does feel left behind, and their government doesn't care about them anymore. I want to be a fighter for them, regardless of your political party. When we work together, we can accomplish great things. But we have to see past political party, and this divisiveness has to come to an end here in America. And I'm going to be somebody that can pull people together so we can get great things done for the state of Maine.
All right, well, we thank you so much for your time and for coming by today, sharing your perspective with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, you.
That is our program for this evening. We hope that these conversations were helpful in showing where the candidates stand on the issues that matter to you. Election Day is right around the corner, and the decisions you make on that day matter. So please be sure to get out and vote. Thank you for watching, and good night.